have all of you here. Greetings to one and all, and welcome to the NeuroNovember convention. We are super excited for this panel, and if I could cite an anecdote, ever since we started planning out the NeuroNovember convention, if there was one thing which we unanimously agreed upon, one panel which we unanimously agreed upon, it was the panel for diversity, inclusivity, and representation, which we aptly call the panel for neuroscience for all. Yeah. So the face of research is changing today with diversity, representation, and inclusion becoming the pillars of advancing research across various fields, especially STEM. And we at Project Encephalon and Stimulus are extremely mindful and supportive of the same. And with that, I think we are good to go and start the panel. I'll introduce myself. My name is Shresh Shekhar, and I'm a third year biology major student at Indian Institute of Science Education and Research. I would invite Snigdha to introduce herself and then the panelists.
Thank you, Shresht. Warm greetings to everyone present here. My name is Snigdha Priyadarshini. I'm a first year engineering undergrad pursuing biotechnology at Vedor Institute of Technology. And I work as a senior content writer for Stimulus. And I am a volunteer for sponsors and collaborations at NeuroNovember. And I'm so glad to join you all. I'd like to introduce the speakers for the day. Our first speaker is Dr. Bittu Rajaraman. He is the Associate Professor of Biology at Ashoka University, where he also heads the Department of Psychology. He, is, he has received a PhD from Harvard University in neuroscience. He looks at neuroethology of temporal pattern recognition in insects and quantitative and economic cognition more broadly in zebrafish, dogs, and humans. We also have with us Mr. Melvin Salim, who is a PhD candidate at the Middle East Technical University with the Department of Neuroscience and Neurotechnology. He is developing interpretable machine learning and deep learning approaches for the early diagnosis of neurodegeneration using a wide range of imaging and modalities. Our last speaker is Miss Sarita Nolan, who is a senior at UCSD, majoring in psychology with a specialization in human health. She serves as an underrepresented student advisor for the Associated Student Government and the UCSA. She is the co founder of the Disabled in Higher Education and the Disabled Mental Health Matters movement on Twitter, which serves both to empower the disabled community in higher education and the coexistence of disability and mental health. I welcome you all.
Okay. So with the introductions underway, I think we can kickstart the panel. This is a question which is very basic but it's extremely important. So, what does diversity actually mean? I mean, is it merely acknowledging the presence of different opinions or people, or is it integrating a more dynamic and holistic approach where everyone can feel a sense of belonging and thrive? Basically, how does the idea of inclusivity lay in and interplay with the idea of diversity, specifically in a field such as neuroscience? I think, Sarita, we could start with you and we could keep going in a rotational manner.
Thank you so much. So, in terms of diversity, if you have disability in your diversity statement, it's not enough unless you're actually committed to including them through like actual accessibility accommodations when needed, but also going beyond that as well. Because if you stop at just the accommodations and the accessibility, it's just a medical model of seeing students with disabilities as a liability. And here's something we need to do to help you overcome that. It's not until we actually embrace an environment where disabled faculty members, disabled staff can feel like they have a safe environment to share their own disabilities, where we have disabled grad students who can mentor disabled undergrads, where we can all succeed and thrive together, where we don't have barriers anymore. We have bridges being built to support each other. And without these bridges to support each other, you really have exclusion within any diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, which creates a direct, like, it's just not going to be what you're looking for in terms of diversity. Because if you actively exclude, you can't have that kind of diversity. You need to be a champion for disabled students, for disabled staff in your lab, and to learn and be willing to listen and to be willing to realize that there are some magical capabilities about people with disabilities. We're just so driven that we problem solve, and yeah, it just needs there needs to be more done to actually work towards true diversity and inclusion for disability beyond the word disability.
Yeah, I think Dr. Bittu, if you could add on to that.
Yeah, I think that I mean I'm really thrilled to be on this panel with all of you, because I really love the sort of the inputs coming in, and I think this by itself shows the value of diversity in the following sense. You know, at least I've seen that and especially as you sort of go up sort of the chain of kind of as a grad student to faculty and so on, one finds that any statements of diversity tend to sort of ring pretty hollow when it comes to the actual situation that we face while we navigate the system. And it's one thing for us to say it's good for everybody, for the community to be diverse. It's good for everybody, for everyone to feel included. But in neuroscience in particular, I think we must and we will go beyond that to say the field is suffering because of the incredibly narrow range of people who have done neuroscience and psychology and biology so far. And the inclusion of people who are diverse from the perspectives of gender and race and caste and disability and many more aspects of marginality that we still don't see in the specific context of India, including Islamophobia. I think these are all aspects that are crucial for us doing good neuroscience and doing good psychology, right? And I think we've seen sort of the limitations of the ways in which these fields are approached, and really the staleness of ideas in the field when the same kinds of people do this based on the same kinds of ideas of human behavior. Now, we as neuroscientists are uniquely positioned to sort of explain the ways in which social conditioning and the ways in which all of these power structures influence the brain, influence all of academia, not just neuroscience. And those perspectives are just not going to enter the field if neuroscience and psychology continue to be done by a very narrow subset of people. So I think it's less about including us in the mainstream and more about allowing the mainstream to be interrogated by us.
Yeah, that's actually very relevant. Melvin,
Yes.
would you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I completely agree on all the points of Srita and Bitu, and also thank you all for this invitation. For me, actually, as I learned, teams are diverse as they include the most different or the most different person in the team. So if you are the person who identifies extremely different than the other parts of the team, and you feel excluded, and team won't be able to thrive, won't be able to produce something, and won't be able to get something from you, or you won't be able to contribute to them. So that's not the team. And to me, neuroscience is one of the most diverse fields ever. It's not basically psychology, it's not basically biology, it's not basically engineering. And the integration of these fields by heart requires diversity, and diversity is always incomplete without inclusion. So we need to include anyone and everyone from every background, and also we need to start from students like you, actually, because it starts with us, and once we change, and I believe all the institutions would change. I'm hopeful about it, and thank you.
Right, so
Yeah.
I think that was an excellent answer. Shresh, do you wanted to add?
No, I'm just saying that I actually agree with the fact that change starts at a very formative level. Uh, it's very difficult to sort of get change at it's easy, it's doable, but it's difficult to get a change at levels at which people have become accustomed to that mindset. But at this
Mm,
stage, when we're just entering academia, I think it's very relevant that we actually make appropriate changes and into our lifestyle, into our thinking, and sort of incorporate this into the idea of inclusivity with the idea of diversity. Yeah.
right. I think this is an excellent note for us to move into our next question, which was how has the field of neuroscience and academia changed with the influx of diversity? But before that, has there been any influx in diversity from the time that you had joined and from the current time at which we are in? And to Melvin's point, does the current field provide impetus and incentive for people who are different to come forward and not feel excluded?
Yeah.
So I
I
think
think I
I'd
think
like,
Melvin could go ahead.
yes, I was just about to say that.
Me? Yes.
All right, we can start with you,
Yeah,
Sarita.
we can start
And
with Sarita.
Yeah.
We can,
Thank you so much. So I think being early in neuroscience, like I just entered in last year as a senior here in my undergrad. And it's all like it's so alien still for disabilities. And we're actually incentivized to not include people with disabilities because there's a cost to the accommodations. There's a cost to not having things completed as fast. And you think those are the things that lead to not wanting to include someone with disabilities. But if something's completed slower, but it's completed accurately, if we have an ability to really problem solve, there are benefits of having disabled students in lab. And I just don't see that inclusivity at all. Like, I feel like advocating for disabled undergraduate research programs is something that no one's considered to really think about supporting undergraduates with disabled mentors who are graduates and thinking about having grants for principal investigators to make their labs accessible and to help remove some of those barriers on a level with that school system at maybe a country's cost to help universities make it more accessible for students with disabilities. But until there's a way to reduce the barriers of cost to help a student with disabilities, there will still be barriers that are insurpassable. And I just don't see us there. I see a lot of animosity. I see students with disabilities on Twitter being the victims of sexual abuse and like inappropriate handling from their postdocs. I see students with disabilities dealing with medical insurance that doesn't allow them to actually thrive in their careers. And I really see that there still needs to be a shift globally in how we see people with disabilities for actually the benefits, the strengths that they can bring into the labs and not being seen as someone that we're not sure about, but really knowing that disabilities, so many of them are neurological, and someone with a different perspective, whose brain is wired a different way, may be able to find a different solution that you may not be able to find utilizing the same neural pathways that people who are neurotypical have. Like, what if we let autistic researchers in to truly begin to solve the problems that face those who deal with autism? What if we let people who are schizophrenic come in brain wired so differently to truly attack that problem from a neurological perspective. Like, what if we allowed neuroscience to open? The world could change.
I definitely agree to that point. I mean, that's a terrific point about having variety of that. That's what diversity means in the end. Having variety of opinions and having them come.
Right. I think when Shresht and I were writing all of these questions, we were just talking about how funny the word all is, right? The title of our panel is Neuroscience for All. It's a three-letter word, but it means everything, right? And when you talk about a field as sophisticated as neuroscience, and you have these words, neuroscience and all, in one sentence, it almost seems like a paradox. So, is it still a paradox? Is that a or are we moving into converting this apparent paradox into a reality? I'd like to direct that to you, Melvin, first, and then we'll go on to Bittu.
Well, uh,
Right.
thank you for all the points, Rita. Again, your questions are opening my mind. Uh, Actually, I can agree all from trans perspective, because being trans is something cost to institutions and all the companies. Uh, when hiring a trans, it's necessary to provide some transition cost and mental effects of it, and it's uh, generally neglected and it's not considered. And as a person with anxiety, I also agree with that, because nobody cares when you have anxiety, when you can't speak and you can't share your opinion. Nobody respects you and nobody listens to you. And it's also another point to bring those people in the field. And actually, in every countries, we need to increase awareness of the perspective of diversity, but and also we need uh, safe spaces for everyone. Without having any safe spaces, we won't be able to thrive. So we need to start with respect for individuals' identity, even whether they are disabled or neurodiverse or trans or queer, whatever, because it's part of their identity and it's necessary for them to thrive. So we need to respect and we need to provide that space. But currently, in virtual environment, I'm able to see that in some spaces like NeuroMatch at a conference, they are able to provide that in a setting. But as a trans researcher, a trans person open to social media, I also we noticed that we are also victim of many assaults. So there need to be clear ways to stop such situations, and I think that's all.
Right.
But
Thank you
in
so
physical
much.
world, it's hard. It's hard to provide those inclusion, and it costs a lot. But somebody should do that.
I think this is an excellent note for us to redirect the question to Dr. Bittu, who has had years of experience in the field of academia. So I ask you, sir, uh, what do you think? Is the field right now a good time for neuroscientists who are different, who identify themselves as different, to join in?
Well, the time is never right, and if we wait for the right time, it's going to be years. So, I mean, so I think from our perspective, it's one of really jumping in and taking the reins, regardless of whether the world is ready, and we will make the world ready, right? That's what all of us are trying to do together here. On the question of whether, so I completely agree with Sarita and with Melvin on what needs to be done, and on sort of the costs that sometimes are involved in making spaces inclusive. But I think that it's also important to say how the state of aggressiveness that we're in right now,
Yeah.
and the urgency with which it needs to be interrogated, I think, far outweighs any costs of inclusion. By that I mean the following things, right? The question that you asked was one of how the field has changed with the influx of diversity. I will say that the influx of diversity around caste and disability is virtually nil. That is to say, there is in India with reservation, there is the provision again for diversity, but not for inclusion. And people, are from marginalized castes are treated horribly to this day. And I've seen the ways in which people have been humiliated in departmental spaces, starting from when they're in school, but of course perpetuating in universities, in university spaces. Around disability, there's virtually no inclusion. Again, several universities in India, thanks to reservation and thanks to Baba Saheb Ambedkar's sort of really visionary ideas for how diversity should work, there are positions for people to be hired with disabilities in institutional spaces. But again, and those have created a lot of difference in the Indian context around disability. But it is still far from enough. When I talk about the urgency, I refer to the fact that most people are still teaching psychology texts that use extremely primitive classifications of order and disorder. To this day, people, students, graduate students with disabilities are forced in some sense by the textbooks that they have to teach about themselves as disordered and disabled, in using language which is extremely pejorative and medicalized rather than self-defined, right? And so there is an urgent need for these notions of an understanding. So, from a neurodiverse perspective, and from the perspective also of genetics, and understanding that, in some sense, we're all mutants, right? We're here because we are all mutants. We're human and not chimp because we are all mutants. And that understanding then that, of course, there's going to be a large range of genetic diversity amongst us, and therefore neurodiversity, which is not just, which is going to go beyond genetic diversity. It's also going to include the diversity in our conditioning, right? So, genetics and social conditions convolve together at every step as the brain sort of, remodels itself. We understand these things, but these are not socially out there. And even though we know enough to understand these things, we do not implement this understanding of the brain when it comes to hiring in neuroscience departments, when it comes to provisions for how to make graduate schools safe spaces, undergraduate spaces safe, how it is that schools should be designed, right? Because already by the time most students in India go through school, they've been destroyed for the rest of their lives, right? I mean, in terms of how really their thinking has been trampled upon, the ways in which they've experienced exclusion at very, very young ages. And those create lifelong anxieties, right? Lifelong anxieties that are difficult to address later in life. So really, my hope is that we see the urgency of this requirement and that we move there collectively.
I mean, there are two excellent points that you pointed out. One would be the difference between diversity and inclusion. Speaking about our country, which has provisions for diversity, maybe to show, but not necessarily for inclusion. And next would be these awful social constructs of implicit bias and sort of other determinants exist because we make room for it at the grassroots level at schools. So these are very, very important takeaway points. Shresh,
Yeah, I would like to point this question to Sarita. I mean, Annapurna has brought up a very interesting point. She asks whether what kind of, so it takes a bit of effort, right? It takes a bit of effort from the colleagues and peers of differently wired people to sort of support them in the way which is required, in the way which should actually be there. And so how do you a common consensus? Do you have like a uniform system, or is it subjective, or how do you actually understand and support or empathize with everyone in that case?
I think first it's about listening and truly understanding the perspective of the person with disabilities. And I would like to take a slight pause here away from the question for a second. Differently wired, differently abled, we prefer disabled, whether it's person with disabilities or disabled person. Disability is our reality. And to skirt around the word disability is a rejection of our truth. It's like calling a transgendered person differently gendered. I'm pretty sure that would not be something that they would like to be called. The reality is transgender. The reality is disabled. And even differently abled, I'm not able to speak Indian. Some of you may not be able to play piano. We all have different disabilities because we're human. So that's why we don't use differently abled. Even within people who are normative, there's different kinds of wiring between men and women. Some people are more left brain, some people are more right brain. So yeah, so we celebrate who we are as
Yeah.
with our different abilities as humans, but not because we're disabled. And the same with special needs. Our needs aren't special. They're human needs that we all have. It just requires a different pathway to meet them. And yeah, I think that once you have a person with disabilities in your lab, the experience of being able to listen and understand their passion and help them to meet that passion and find a way to be that scientist in the lab who can be productive and not to strike them down in any way with ableism by making them feel less than, make them feel respected, seen, and heard, and not like they're a burden to you. Check in on them and make sure that they're okay. And those communication skills with a student with disabilities is something that will help you throughout your career, that will help you be a better mentor in the end. So, really, that student with disabilities does you a favor. It opens your mind to a different way of seeing, and they open your lab to a different way of seeing your research that you've seen for so long, because you have this curse of knowledge yourself. You've seen your research for so long. There's one way you might see. And it's amazing to be able to see how much your research can open up with someone with disabilities in your lab. So no matter how hard it is all worth it to have a student with disabilities. And that's why disability should be truly included and not just, should we do this? It should be a
Yeah.
priority.
It's about accepting the truth rather than misconstruing it and putting it in different manners. I definitely, that's a very great point, and that brings me to my next question. So in the field at which we are, I mean, as neuroscientists and as the people who have sort of the ability to be able to think how others think, as Bittu correctly mentioned before. Um, what neuropsychological correlates could be drawn to explain the various aspects of the society and the traditional mindset, which which somehow do not allow diversity and inclusivity to flourish at its peak? Melvin, would you like to start with that?
Uh, from my experience, I always seen academia and related neuroscience and related fields as the reflection of the society. And I live in Turkey and very close society, and uh, do not have any norm of respecting any gender identity. So it's hard, and uh, this traditional mindset is hard to break. And when all the professors get older and they become to the just feeling so close that mindset, and they don't want to change anything. For example, gender neutral restrooms, which are really necessary for us at the early stage of transition, or non-binary trans people. It's not just something we want to. It's not optional, actually. It's really necessary for our life. And I've seen some students who never use the bathroom and uh, wait all day, and it's one of the troubles of being trans, and it's really common in my friends, and everyone identifies as trans. And the other thing is name change. People don't change their names usually. They just start life with the given name and they get married. If they supposed to, they change that then. But as trans people, we are in the need of changing names due to our transition. And once a student starts transition and finds the name, academia starts to question their identity. You were prefer using that name, but you changed now. Who are you? Like that, and it can be really triggering the depression of the trans people, as I observed. And those are two big issues. And I don't know what should be done, but the change starts with us. So that's the thing I really want to. I really believe and want to see all around. And yeah, we need to break traditions because that's it.
Bittu, would you want to add on to that? I mean,
The need to break traditions.
Well, certainly, I mean, certainly, traditions are made to be broken. but, I think that there's specific things I want to get at with respect to your question. Right.
yeah.
I want to point out that, the part of the question that I didn't answer from the earlier question was this question of how diversity has changed. Well, the only places where I've seen some change since when I was a graduate student are in terms of gender and race. And when I say gender, I mean largely in the gender binary, the sort of the greater presence of women in largely cis women in the field. I mean, it's a huge thing. When I was in graduate school, when I was doing my PhD, we had 2 tenured women in our department. And the ways in which, women were spoken about in the department, in the context of India, it's very rare to hear faculty members being talked about in the same way as they are in the US. But in the US, it's routine for women to be referred to as bitches. And words like these get thrown around even in the academic space with respect to faculty members. And they set a tone in the department, at least for me. I felt like that, I was getting very clear messaging about who would be respected if they laid down the law in their lab, and who would be disrespected if they laid down the same kind of rules in their labs. I've seen some things move a little bit around race, and those very, and I think a lot of, in fact, I'm just blown away by what Black Lives Matter has done in the last 2 years. I'm seeing scientific spaces question racism in ways that I never dreamed that they would. And again, when I was in graduate school, we had tokenistic diversity, but certainly not inclusion. And I think it was just incredibly difficult to power through that. When I was in India, being somebody from a privileged class and caste background, I have the benefit of the confidence that I picked up over those years when I was not a persecuted minority. In the context of the US, as I come out as trans, and as I, and the way that I was racially perceived, it was the first time that I really saw what it meant for somebody to look at you and not see a human being, but just see what they want to see, right? Just see a reflection of their own bigotry. And the ways in which that impacted the same kind of confidence that I had up to that point, right? This was something that I'd seen theoretically, or I'd known of theoretically before, but it's very different when you experience it yourself. And it just pains me to see it play out over and over again. So I really think that to the extent that movements have affected academia, and really, I'm just blown away by how suddenly so many different spaces are even having the conversation around race in academic circles. To the extent that things have moved around gender, they have largely moved for white cis women, but I am seeing the impact of that. Just in terms of creating more of a conversation around diversity. I'm seeing Black in Neuroscience really sort of push the conversation, to which I'm hoping something changes around caste in neuroscience in India, because caste, gender and race are at least at some level international issues. And most spaces in India are willing to talk about gender and race, but they are not willing to talk about caste because it is such a specific issue here. And caste exclusion is so complete, right? It's so complete in the cultural space in India. As I said, even if you have measures of diversity in some institutions, but not others, we're very far from seeing a system of inclusion. And it's also important to remember as neuroscientists that what is neuroscientific fact or behavioral fact changes as social systems change. And that's not a surprise for neuroscientists, right? Because we know how much society influences the brain. We know how much stress remodels the brain. We know how minority communities experience heightened stress. We know how access to nutrition, which itself is so uneven across India, impacts the ways in which brains develop. There's so much that is said about and so just the facts of how women and men did on standardized testing and the disparities between them 100 years ago. Those facts have changed today. Today, factually, if you're a scientist who trusts their data, you do these assessments and you don't find the same kinds of differences between men and women. And even stubborn differences like the difference in spatial skills, right, which sort of persisted over so many years. Why did it take until 2007 for studies like that by Feng, Spence, and Pratt, which sort of subjected people to 8 hours of playing video games before spatial skills were tested, to find that the spatial skills gap had vastly narrowed, right? These are some of the questions about how, when people say, look, these are two, men and women are these two separate groups, and they can be separate but equal. One finds that things that one didn't think of as being related to inequality, such as video game playing, right? Are boys more encouraged to play video games than girls, culturally speaking? Yes. And just access, things like that, which one thinks of as being part of separate but not being part of inequality, can contribute to inequality. And it's really surprising that studies like this happen only 10 years ago, when they could well have been conceived of 50 years ago. So society changes us as scientists, and it changes the kinds of studies we think of doing. And we have a long history showing the ways in which what we think of as scientific fact have changed, right? Race and its genomic correlates have completely changed, right? We now think of race as being something that's strongly constructed by society based on the perception of particular cues related to biology, right? But to think of racial categories as genomic categories that emerge from the data is just nonsensical. And the most diversity that exists out there exists within the continent of peoples living in Africa. So we see that that our entire understanding of many of these scientific facts changes with the ability to ask new questions. And those abilities come from different locations and seeing what it is that science has produced, and how far from our lived reality we perceive that those studies to be. So I'm looking forward to a lot more work of this kind in the future.
Yeah, I would like to hold on to your point about the discrimination. So the differences which you mentioned about caste, which is like specific to India, and in that case, if you belong to an intersection of sort of differently able communities, or so how is that perceived as being different from being belonging to one specific community? Or does that have equal correlates, or does that get sort of mellowed down by you belong? So suppose I would like to bring in Sirita into the discussion. So you are a Black and you are disabled, and there are certain situations where one of your differences might overpower the other differences, leading to lack of acknowledgement by the others. So how much do you think is the prevalence of such? Is this prevalent, and how do you think this could be targeted? How could this be changed?
Yeah, I was beginning to type a very long comment because when you think about Black Lives Matter, you hear this narrative running. So many Black people are being killed by police. this number of Black people. You lose the intersection of disability in that message when over 50% of people killed by police are disabled. You go back to the American history of Black people who were brought over from Africa, strong Black men and women to tend the fields. When they stood there on the shores of America, they were sold for their ability to go out on the field and do whatever the plantation owner wanted them to do. If a person like me, Black and disabled, stood there, I would have no value. I still have no value in Black Lives Matter because then it changed to Black disabled lives matter. Oh, wait, you're taking away from our message. That's not reasonable. So, being Black, I face health inequities, but also I face the eugenics perspective of disability, where our life isn't seen as valuable. Maybe my quality of life is not good, living every moment in pain. Maybe that death was inevitable. Maybe it's compassionate that they were killed by the police. We don't need to mention that. It's all the intersections cause greater degrees of this barrier after barrier after barrier, because even being invisibly disabled and Black, I go out the doors of my dorm and I am first Black. And then I get to my car at a handicap space, then the two come together. And then I can be chastised for being Black and disabled. And literally, there was one point when I stood at my handicap space. An older white gentleman was telling me to leave that space for someone who needed it. He accused me of stealing my mom's handicap placard. And my mom's actually healthier than I am. And when these intersectionalities come together, racism, ableism, feminism, it's a harder thing to be like, oh wait, will they really mesh within my lab? Like, if your lab is filled with people who are of a higher caste, people who are abled, people who aren't like them, maybe you don't see the space, the value that they bring to your lab. You have an inherent lack of value for that person because that's what's been taught. Here in America, when someone's disabled, parents might say, don't look, don't stare. Maybe that child wants to be inquisitive and wants to ask them a question, but you strike down that inquisitive nature. Not seeing, not hearing, not speaking to them long enough. Disabilities don't exist. Disabilities disappear. Generation after generation after generation of disregarding the reality of disabilities, we come around to differently abled, special needs, and we don't see disability anymore. We don't recognize the reality of disability anymore. And every time, differently abled, differently wired, differently whatever, you kind of just perpetuate what societal norms have taught us to believe of disabilities. And it just becomes so much worse when we don't have healthcare access as Black people in the same way to truly be able to thrive as people with disabilities. And our universities only give us the tools to kind of survive with accommodations and accessibility. Nothing says they want us here in the programs that they offer. We don't even get to know that there's disabled grad students at our institution that could mentor us. I had to basically co-found the disabled ad hoc committee to bring together students with disabilities to rise up against the University of California system to truly lift our voices together to make substantial change. So that is the burden of intersectionality.
That is an excellent point for us to bring together two of the things that you had mentioned and Dr. Bittu had mentioned. So, Dr. Bittu spoke about how different questions come from different locations, and you can only get access to those different locations and different questions when you create a safe space for people to join you. And you spoke, and Sarita very rightly said that this safe space has not been created because there are so many things. There's your Black first, and being and under that Black and under the black, your disability and many other things get blurred. So I want to redirect this to you, Melvin. What do you think? How do you perceive an ideal safe space should be, right? Which welcomes perspectives
Mhm.
and which makes people feel home, which does not view them as anything less than a human being,
Mhm.
because that's the situation that we live in right now.
Yeah, I also agree all the points in the perspective of being transgender, because in the world of binary, we are completely excluded in everywhere, especially in research. We know male brains, we know female brains. What about trans brains? Don't we
Right.
exist? I was trans before starting transition, before knowing myself. I was born trans, but biological aspects of that, where is it? And for the sex-based definition, uh, it starts with inner respect. When you develop that sense of inner respect, you respect the nature and every living or non-living things, and you start to feel that respect to human and animals and everywhere. But where it starts is the question. Maybe it starts from very early age, when you lose that bond to your inner innocence. The society also loses that respect and loses that spirit, as I observed. So it starts with within the inner sense, but to include people, we need to first think to ask. One of the things I noticed that if I were a cis man, and then there are many cis men around, they think like, I don't need diversity. I'm a cis man. I'm a cis hetero man. So I live in this world very well. I don't need you. No, you need us. You need us to survive. Your uh, social normativity need us to survive, because you are constructed in a way that you're squeezed in the manliness understanding of society, and it's shaping your understanding in a very wrong way. So, for example, in my country, it's very common for men to kill the loved ones. So there are many things going on the news all the time. Many women and trans women are being killed just for their love. That's kind of situation. So they murder by love, by their definition. But it's very masculine and very society related thing, and it needs to stop. So we in the we need to start to provide respected spaces and uh, very well defined boundaries for people.
Mm.
So without that, speaking of safe space would be just an arbitrary thing.
These are excellent points, and the need of respect for people. And it's crazy that we even need to talk about having respect for human beings when it should be something that should be ingrained in all of us, right? And a question that I have to follow up to what all three of you said is that it is important for the academia world to first recognize diversity, but also to understand that hiring different people, you shouldn't just hire them as tokens. You hire them because their perspective matters. And when you have people of their perspective, you open your services to a broader range of people, you make it more accessible. So, what steps do you think that fields in academia are taking right now, or that they should be taking to to give a platform to people and value their perspective, not just hire them as tokens? I'd start with you, Dr. Bittu.
Oh. Okay. There's a lot that can be said about this, but I think that and there's also a difference in how I would phrase this for an Indian audience and for an international audience. But I will lead with phrasing this as an Indian audience, because I can see most of the people here are from India, and in the context of India, we've had a particularly fraught backlash that has been faced by Dalit, Adivasi, and Bahujan scientists and academics more generally in the context of reservation. And I can see from the chat box also that a lot of questions are about this, right? Should one name a category? Is it discrimination to even name a category and then hire people based on those categories? Is it tokenization to implement reservation and so on? I think, something that Sarita said is key to emphasize. It is important to listen, right? So such questions should not come from the perspective of somebody who is from a position of privilege saying this is what should happen, right? But one should listen and ask. And I think that people who have and so Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi academics have fairly consistently said it is important to name. It is not important to just sort of say, oh, we're all equal. It will be discrimination for me to even name, the fact that somebody has faced marginalization in their lives. So it is important to name, but it is also important to then ensure no discrimination. So, for example, we see in universities when students enter, very often the category. So certainly, reservation needs to be implemented at the point of intake, but after intake, for people to be named and essentially shamed by administrations who put up caste categories and the lists of students who are in those caste categories, that should not happen. And so we do this with trans students as well. We say you should absolutely create space for trans people to apply, but once trans students are in an institution, it should be their choice as to whether they want to be publicly identified as trans or not. And they should have the option to do so and the option to not do so. And likewise around caste. It is, people underestimate the incredible effect of even having faculty members who are Dalit, Adivasi, and Bahujan in the faculty. For students, they are that safe space, right? You have to remember that before I was at Ashoka, I was at the University of Hyderabad, where 5 Dalit students were essentially subjected to a process of punishment by the university for their political activity. And Rohit, my friend, a young Dalit student, died. He killed himself in the context of this kind of institutional discrimination. But it is worth pointing out that he was also the only person who didn't have a faculty mentor who was also Dalit and who therefore understood what he might be facing. So, the difference between having faculty members who, regardless of whether they are want to talk about the experience of being Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi in neuroscience, but who are just there, who are visible as people who are in the system, who are faculty, who have navigated the system, who can mentor. This makes a huge difference. And I think some students have also asked if we can crowdsource a list of people who would want to quietly mentor students who are Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, because we have some really fantastic students, just incredibly bright students who, who I'm afraid of how the system is treating them now as we speak, right? So I'm hoping that we can change all of this. Yes, I will sort of just end by saying that the steps, therefore, that must be taken are certainly steps around diversity and steps around inclusion. But those steps around inclusion will only come once one has people to speak from the perspective of marginalization within the university and listening to the perspectives of people from marginalizations and especially from overlapping and intersectional marginalities, because that is extremely crucial, right? One finds, for example, I find that if people, for example, my current university is extremely trans-friendly, but does not have an intersectional approach with respect to caste. And therefore, I find that among the students who apply from intersecting marginalities of transness and caste, that they get essentially left by the wayside. So you can have institutional spaces that are very good around one aspect of marginality, but not others. And so it's important to really take both. And often not just two, right? I mean, several people face multiple marginalities. Marginalizations around caste and class are often correlated with one another, and singular sort of exceptions to that cannot be cited as evidence to counterweigh the sort of the overall and very clear statistical relationship between these two. So I always feel like just caste by itself often deserves a whole panel simply because of how underrepresented marginalized caste perspectives are. And I'm hoping by the next NeuroNov that we can also crowdsource a list of people who would want to talk about these things, who would want to put their perspectives forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think we could go on for a very long while, but we have a talk starting
That's right.
in the
at three
next
o'clock.
minute. And
Minutes.
I'm
That's right.
so, and I didn't realize that we had 1 hour passed away so quickly. And I'd like Shresht to put in his concluding remarks.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think I definitely agree with Snigdha with everything she says, and we'll definitely try to have a panel based on cast next NeuroNov if it happens. And yeah, this was a great session. I enjoyed it a lot. I am sure everyone in the audience enjoyed it a lot. And no matter what happens, we are a little more knowledgeable than before uh, through this panel, and I hope we were able to convey the important information and help people gain more knowledge about the subject.